space. And then more recently, I've written a very, very long poem called Broken Streets of My City, La Calle Rota de mi Ciudad. And this was produced last year, and it's all, I'm sure you've all heard about the ruins in Havana, and it's all about walking through the city of Havana. And in fact, I fell one day in the city because of the terrible pavement. And so it also tells that whole story of a city that's broken. I'm here with my parents. Just to give you a sense of what the book looks like. And just some lines from I come back, an old child, now they call me señora. I still come back after so many years, an old little girl, una niña vieja. And my dream to walk those streets with my parents who've never been back to Cuba. So I've been back many times, and my parents have never wanted to go. And you'll see the movie, those of you that could stay afterwards, Adiós Querida, which I made at the end of the 1990s, early 2000s. I made this movie, and this was how I started getting into research about the Jews of Cuba. And I dedicated the film to my father, whom you see here, who was very against my trips to Cuba. And but I wanted to make a film for him to show him that the Sephardic Jews are still present in Cuba. So that was the rationale for that. So now researching this community. So that begins for me in the 1990s. So I start traveling to Cuba regularly in the 1990s, and this is a period of great change in Cuba. As many of you probably know, what they call the special period after the fall of the Soviet Union, and Cuba loses its major economic supporter. And this is a moment when there's a return to religion. The government also changes its policy with regard to who can be a member of the Communist Party. It becomes possible in the 90s to be a member of the Communist Party and to have a religious affiliation. Up until that point, you had to declare your atheism in order to be a member of the party, and they begin to allow people to maintain a religious faith if they wish. And I love this picture, these pictures from here on, the black and white pictures are by Humberto Mayol, a great photographer that I worked with on my project. And this is a picture, not from the project, one of his pictures. And I love it because you see all the different deities, in a sense, of Cuba. You see the political deities, including Karl Marx, and you've got the Sacred Heart of Jesus, you've got Jose Marti there as well. And in case anybody's worried, this is not a Jewish house. So this is the period when the Pope goes to Cuba, 1998. This is this whole period of an opening to religion, and makes a very, very important impact on the return of religion to Cuba. They begin to have Christmas trees for sale, for example, in the late 90s in Cuba. That's a big transformation. And so there's a resurgence of all religious faiths in Cuba in the 90s, not just Judaism, but all Catholicism, the various forms of Christianity, and of course Santeria, Ocha, all of the various African-derived religions become very, very important, start to become very, very important. And now you frequently see people dressed all in white in Cuba, people who have just been initiated. This is a very, very common thing now in Cuba. So now getting to the Jewish story. So the way the community begins to be revived in Cuba is Dr. Jose Miller, who was the leader of the Jewish community throughout the 90s up until the early 2000s. He contacts the Joint Distribution Committee that was mentioned previously by Margalit in the 90s, when there's this whole state opening to religion, and asks the Joint for help in supporting the community and bringing Jewish education to the island and so on, and immediately receives tremendous support for this. And so this revitalization really goes back to him and his efforts. And so this leads to the Cuba boom. And you really can't understand how the Jewish community functions in Cuba without understanding the importance of the Cuba boom, without understanding the role that American Jews have played in supporting this tiny community on the island of about 1,000 Jews that now exist in Cuba. So in the 90s, the National Geographic produces this article. This is 1999, Cuba, Evolution and the Revolution. And anthropologists always say that when National Geographic runs a story on a country, it's then safe for Americans to go visit it. And so this is the period of this kind of resurgence of interest in Cuba. The Cuba craze, and I live in Ann Arbor, and this article is published in that period as well, talking about various people going to Cuba, and this is the moment in which the 90s up through to the present, that many Jewish missions in the United States get formed to visit and to help the Jewish community on the island. And so Cuba starts to become this favorite destination for various kinds of mitzvah projects. For Jews, it's very, very important to give charity, to help those in need, in particular to help other Jews, and Cuba becomes a favorite destination for American Jewish missions. And even Steven Spielberg goes to Cuba in 2002. So this very, very small community becomes a kind of celebrity community where everybody's gaze is on this tiny community that remains on the island. Here's my book. So I made the movie Adiós Querida, and then I felt there was still so much more to say, so then subsequently I produced this book in conjunction with Humberto Mayo. And we were trying to find a way to show visually this conjuncture of Jewish and revolutionary in Cuba. And he took this picture, which I think very nicely shows that relationship. It almost looks as if Che Guevara is inside the synagogue with the Jews that are in procession. So the community managed to remain alive during the 60s and 70s and 80s, during the heyday of the revolution, largely because several of the elders maintained the community. There were young people involved as well, but it was difficult to be part of the Jewish community before the 90s, because if you did participate, it was much more difficult to get a university education. In fact, often impossible if you had any kind of religious affiliation. But the synagogues remained open in Havana. Some of the synagogues in other parts of the country shut down. For example, in Santa Clara, that synagogue shut down because the community contracted to such a point that there was only one person still using the synagogue, and so he had to turn the keys into the government. But now, as I'll say in a minute, now there's a new synagogue in Santa Clara. So some of the synagogues were lost, but then they were subsequently recovered in the last 2 decades. So here you have a contemporary picture of the Patronato. And so this synagogue that, was such an important space, right, for the Jewish community, right before the community dissolves in the early 60s, has now become a kind of pilgrimage site for many American Jews who visit the island. And we happen to live half a block away from the Patronato, so this is also kind of part of my childhood. We could see the synagogue from the window of the apartment where we lived. So just to give you a sense there of the kinds of visits that are very, very frequent. And this is Adela Doran, who now runs the Jewish community on the island. Dr. Miller has since passed away. And she was the vice president and the librarian, because there's also a very important library at the Patronato, Yiddish texts and also many other Jewish texts. And what's so interesting is that this community occupies the spaces that were left behind by the Jewish Cubans who were there before, who are now largely here in Miami. And so all the things that were there before are still there. And this is another conjuncture where you see the Star of David and Jose Marti, another sort of conjuncture of the Jewish and the Cuban. So she now runs the community, and she's a very, very smart woman, educated as a lawyer, and she speaks perfect English, so she often briefs the Jewish missions that come to the island. She's also a fluent Yiddish speaker. And so with the help of the Joint Distribution Committee, B'nai B'rith, and many other American Jewish organizations, they've been able to revitalize Jewish faith and Jewish practice on the island. This is Albertico, who trains the children for bar and bat mitzvah. And Dr. Rosa Behar, again, I'm not related to either Alberto or Rosa that we know of, but we share this important Sephardic last name. And there's a pharmacy in the Patronato because they receive so much aid from the Jewish American groups that go to the island. And so there's a pharmacy there where they redistribute the medicine and distribute it to hospitals all over the island as well. So the community has been revitalized. There's important Jewish practice going on in the 3 synagogues in Havana and synagogues scattered throughout the island. But there's also some Cuban Jews that don't participate in religious practice, who consider themselves communists, consider themselves atheists. This is Fabio Brobart's son, who was mentioned earlier. He's a professor of economics at the University of Havana. There's Enrique Oltuski, who passed away recently, who was also involved with the revolution, fought with Che Guevara, was a minister in the Castro government. And when we went around doing these pictures, we often would ask people, how would you like to be photographed? And he asked to be photographed with Jose Marti. And this is Ernesto Altschuler, and he is, again, a secular Jew on the island. He's the dean of the physics department at the University of Havana, and his big dream is to build a statue of Einstein at the University of Havana, still seeking funding for that project. And so in doing this project, I was really interested to see what souvenirs, what memories people kept of their Jewish past, their Jewish identity. And so when I would go and interview people, people would have things ready for me. They would take things out and say, I have this and I have that. So this is Alberto showing the talit that his grandfather from Turkey brought to Cuba, and much other memorabilia that he had there. This is Sara. Very, very interesting person as well, and she's holding up a picture of the last quinceañera that was held in the Patronato in 1959. All these women turned 15 in 1959, and then there's a picture of herself, and she said, of all those women, I'm the only one still left in Cuba. So you often get this feeling when you're with members of the community on the island, this kind of shipwrecked kind of feeling, like they're the last ones there, kind of holding on to Jewish tradition on the island. This is Ida, whose father was a survivor of Auschwitz, and she was born in Cuba, but her mother and her sister came on a Polish passport, which she's holding up here. And here is the uniform that her father wore in the concentration camp, which he brought with him to Cuba. And I also traveled around the island and tried to meet with as many of the Jews as I could all over Cuba. This is in Santi Espiritu. Unfortunately, Jose Varlia has since passed away, but his wife, Daisy, who's a convert to Judaism, maintains the community in Santi Espiritu. And I was really fascinated to find that their house is lavishly decorated with Stars of David in a small town like Santi Espiritu. And then these boys are holding up their conversion documents. And so one thing that's important to know about this community is that it's largely a mixed community. I only found about a dozen people that are Jewish, both on their mother's and father's side. Most people are Jewish on one side of the family. Sometimes it's just a Jewish grandparent. And many have also married into the Jewish tribe as well. And so these boys were Jewish on the father's side of the family, and they converted, and they're holding up their conversion documents. And I talk about this in the book, that men undergo circumcision, many of them in their 60s and 70s, in order to convert. And the Joint Distribution Committee sends a rabbi, Rabbi Steinhandler, who's Argentine, and he goes to Cuba periodically to oversee the conversions, the circumcisions, weddings, and so on. And they also send other rabbis as well from Latin America, largely because they are Spanish-speaking. They also send teachers from Argentina, usually a couple, a male and female couple, who go and spend 2 to 3 years in Cuba. But now this community is very, very educated. They run their own services. There isn't a full-time rabbi living in the community. And now we'll see pictures, these pictures of Jaime Gans Greens, and he lives in Palma Soriano. And it was a really amazing thing for me to be able to visit him. I went to Santiago de Cuba and I was taken to meet him. He's a very, very reclusive, very, very shy person. He's the last Jew living in the town of Palma Soriano, which is about an hour from Santiago de Cuba. And it was an amazing day that I spent with him. He had all these things that he had kept that he'd never shared with anybody, like this letter in Yiddish and this picture of relatives who died in the Holocaust, and then this incredible photograph taken by Humberto Mayo that Jorge used in the publicity. And so his family was Hungarian Jewish, and after the revolution, they chose to stay. He never married. His parents and aunt and uncle lived in Palma Soriano. He has a picture of himself in a tuxedo, on a bar mitzvah picture of himself in his tuxedo. And so he started taking out all these things that he had kept in a drawer and pulled out this card that obviously has the Hitler stamps that apparently was sent from a concentration camp to Cuba. And it was very shocking to see this. This was the last thing I expected to find in Cuba. And it's a very powerful picture because you also see the state of his hands. And so this is a man who comes from a bourgeois middle class background, and now he largely survives through agriculture, and you see that in his hands. And so let me tell you just a couple of other stories, maybe still have another minute here. So this is David Tache, who is the director of the Jewish community in Santa Clara. And for him, it was very important to renovate the cemetery, the Jewish cemetery in Santa Clara, because it was in very, very bad shape. He also had a Holocaust memorial built there, and this has become a very, very important site, not just for Jewish visitors, but for Cuban school children who are taken to the cemetery so that they can learn about the Holocaust and learn about the Jewish presence on the island. So briefly, the Cuban government has of course noticed all this interest that there is in the Jewish community, and they've built a hotel called Hotel Raquel in La Habana Vieja in Old Havana. This is a Jewish themed hotel, and get a little view of it there. And each room carries the name of an Old Testament figure. So there's the Abraham room, and the Sarah room, and the Rebecca room, and the Isaac room. And of course there is a Ruth room. And several years ago when I was in Cuba with a group, I stayed in the Ruth room. And I talk about that in a chapter of my book, about the ironies of staying in a hotel room that carries my name and wondering whether I still have any kind of home in Cuba, or is all I have a hotel room with my name on it. So trying to be really fast, I just want to share one more set of stories with you. And this man is kind of known as the Schnorr in Havana, and just to show you how stories get back to the island as well. So he's holding up this New York Times article about the Jewish community in Cuba. So everything gets back to the island as well. And I just want to briefly share this story, the freedom to travel anywhere in the world. And if you stay to see the movie, you'll see Danaida, who's one of the protagonists in Adiós Querida, and I've known her since she was a very little girl, since the 1990s. And you'll hear a little bit of her story in the movie. Very, very interesting story, because her father is Sephardic, and Jose Levy was a major figure in the revitalization of the Sephardic community in Cuba. And so she's Sephardic on her father's side, and then here's her mother, who's Afro-Cuban and who's also a Jehovah's Witness. And so she grew up with this very, very interesting mix, living in her mother's home, but also being brought up as a Jew by her father. And here they are at the Centro Sefaradi. And you'll see this in the movie. And so Jose Levy himself is the one who teaches his daughter Torah and prepares her for her bat mitzvah. And but she always had this dream of eventually moving to Israel, eventually making Aliyah. And her sister, her older sister, who is a santera, a daughter of a different father, so she had all three religions growing up. So she's the daughter of a different father, same mother, so that's why she's not Jewish. And she is a singer as well. You'll see her in the movie. Very, very talented singer. And she was singing in a club in La Rampa in Havana and was discovered by a fellow Cuban who had this band, the guy that you see there in the suit, and guess where they are? Poland.
I read your book.
You read my book. Okay, so they are in Poland, and so he basically made an offer to her to go to Poland and play in his band, and she went, and then she got tired of being in that all-male band and formed an all-female band in Poland. Here she is only, you'll see her in the movie. And all of this created desire in Danaida to leave Cuba, to go elsewhere, to try her luck in Israel. And just before she left, it was very sad because her mother couldn't leave, her mother not being Jewish. And here she is leaving Cuba, last day in Cuba, saying goodbye. And we started communicating via email, which was something we hadn't done when she was still in Cuba. And she spoke about the feeling like an immigrant and all the losses that she felt and missing her mother. And I was able to go to Cuba and visit them there in Beersheba. And there's Hoselavi now in Israel, remaking their lives there. She is a couple of years back. And then she actually started rethinking even her life in Israel and briefly spent a period in Spain selling Dead Sea products in Spain. And there, interestingly enough, she wrote to me, she met a man that she fell in love with, a Dominican, a Dominican guy, and she moved briefly to the Dominican Republic. And when I wrote my book, I thought that was the end of the story. But then they had a child, and now they have since moved to Israel, and I was able to see them again in Israel this past summer in Jerusalem, and there they are. And now her husband, who's Dominican, now he is learning Hebrew very, very quickly, and she and her father have learned Hebrew very, very quickly. So it's another migration, it's another part of the Cuban Jewish story. And I just wish, I don't know if I have a second, no more time. So let me just flip through. I'm now working on the Cuban Jewish community here on the island, and wanted to talk about that, but let me just end then with this beautiful quote from Jose Jose, Cuban Jewish poet. The exile can define himself as one who doesn't have just the one tree, the one flower, the man born in the tropics, ends up singing of the snows of the north. Thank you.
Gathering and two hard acts to follow. Hi, I'm Carrie Bettinger Lopez, and it's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Jorge Duani and Cuban Research Institute and FIU for inviting me. And as Ruth said, it's just such a privilege and honor to be here alongside two of my inspirations, really, Marguerite Bejarano and Ruth Bejar, who were such an important part of my background in writing the history of the Cuban Jewish community in Miami, and the history of that migration over here. And of course, Marcos Carbel was also a very important part of that, both as somebody that I interviewed and also a guide in the community. And I see many familiar faces today, and it's great to see all of you. So I feel a little bit out of place here. I am actually a law professor now at University of Miami Law School, and I've come kind of quite far from from studying the Cuban Jewish community, and yet in some ways it's very familiar. And I was just telling Ruth this morning, I see a lot of continuity between the work that I did as Ruth's student at the University of Michigan, writing my senior thesis and focusing on the Cuban Jewish community of Miami, and then turning it into a book. And the continuity between that and the human rights work that I do now, trying to vindicate human rights violations, tell people's stories, and reclaim rights. And so it's very interesting actually to kind of think back to my past and present lives and those connections. So that kind of leads me to my disclaimer, which is first of all that I'm a little bit out of date on this issue, and the work that I'm going to talk about will take us really up to about 1999-2000 when the book was published. And the reason that I dove into this project was because as I was studying anthropology as an undergraduate at University of Michigan with Ruth, I came to become I became fascinated. I became fascinated with the Cuban Jewish community of Miami. I grew up here in Miami as a Jewish person, but not as a Cuban Jew, and I wasn't actually familiar with the Cuban Jewish community. I grew up in Pinecrest and didn't actually know that there was this thriving Cuban Jewish community on Miami Beach. And so I became very interested in studying that. So what I'm going to focus on now is kind of taking us from the places that Marguerite and Ruth left off in Cuba and transporting us over here to our own community, into pockets that some people like myself didn't even know existed. So, where Marguerite left off was in kind of really articulating this notion of Cuba, which at one point was what many called Hotel Cuba, Ashanse Cuba, right? Many of the Ashkenazim especially were interested in going to Cuba as a point to eventually get to the United States. And of course, as Marguerite and Ruth explained, Cuba became a home. And so as I did my interviews for this book in the late 1990s, one of the things that kept recurring was this theme of what is a hotel, what is a home, the very themes that Ruth was just touching upon. Maybe a good place to start out is a quote from Aaron Kelton, who many of you probably know. He's a former president of the Cuban Hebrew Congregation of Miami. And this quote is just quite beautiful. "Look how things turn out," he said. "Our fathers stayed in Cuba because it was the country closest to the United States, and we came to the United States because it was the country closest to Cuba." So I'll start there, because as we think about this migration, many people, about 3,500 people, in the wake of the Cuban Revolution, came to Miami from Cuba's Jewish community. And as the years passed and the revolutionary regime solidified, these populations sought to take their lives off hold and establish new lives for themselves here in Miami. The Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 caused a sense of despair amongst the Cuban Jewish exiles in Miami. And I want to read, as I did my research for this book, I found a lot of really wonderful information in the archives of the synagogues, which I'll talk about in a moment. And so I tried to draw on that whenever possible to kind of tell the story in the words of the community at that time. So this is a memoir published in 1965 by somebody named Izzy. They actually didn't give their last name. Izzy writes, "What do we do now? Things have changed. Return doesn't seem so easy anymore. Our vacations are extending. Our money is used up. No matter what we do, we have to cry. How far away are those days when we thought of short vacations and a prompt return?" And this really, I think, captures the sentiment of so many people that I interviewed, where they felt like this period in the early 1960s was this watershed moment in their lives, where all of a sudden they were coming to terms with the fact that this community here in South Florida was going to be the new home. So one solution this community thought was to join Miami Beach's established Jewish community, which included Ashkenazic and Sephardic synagogues and community centers. But what they found was that the Jewish community in Miami Beach reacted largely with coldness and indifference to the Cuban Jewish community members who would come over. And why was this? Well, in many ways there was this prevailing anti-Cuban sentiment. There was a misperception that the Cuban Jews, in addition to being independently wealthy, were receiving extensive financial support from the Cuban refugee program that the United States government had organized. But one synagogue on Miami Beach did open its doors to the Cuban Jews. That was Miami Beach's Temple Menorah. Many of you will remember that, I'm sure, from your childhoods. And there, Rabbi Meir Abramovitz offered Cuban exiles free synagogue membership, free Hebrew school, allowed use of the facilities for social events, and as I'm sure many people remember, came up with the familiar play on the song Hava Nagila to Havana Nagila. So really, what I found through this research, which I was not expecting to find, was that the Cuban Jewish exiles felt like they belonged nowhere in Miami. They had arrived in the United States with this political identity of Cuban exiles who were fleeing communism, and religion was really an afterthought in their departure from Cuba. And you see here's a photo from, and I apologize for the quality of these photos. My archival materials are stored somewhere and I couldn't get access to them. But these are photos actually that are taken from my book. And this is a photo of from 1963 of several members of the Cuban Jewish community posing with this statue of Jose Marti in Bayfront Park, and you see the Cuban flag in the background. And so, they have this profound sense of being Cuban exiles. But once they enter South Florida and are experiencing this antagonism from the Jewish community in Miami Beach, they begin to take on the identity of Jews. And they're trying to manifest that through their interactions in the community. And many Cuban exiles now see them as Jews once they kind of hit Miami. And the Jews from Cuba tend to settle on Miami Beach. The Catholic and other Cubans tend to settle on mainland Miami. And so this kind of geographic as well as religious division is starting to shift the ways in which this population is identifying itself. So once they realized that their stay in South Florida was no longer temporary, their attitudes towards their new home really changed dramatically. And in 1961, marked the founding of the Círculo Cubano Hebreo de Miami, the Cuban Hebrew social circle of Miami. And this was largely modeled on the Patronato, the synagogue that you saw. And it included members of both the Sephardic and Ashkenazic community who really sought to recreate the social and religious space. This is a plaque in the Cuban Hebrew congregation, currently on Miami Beach, and you'll see the way this evokes the memory of the Patronato in such an explicit way, and most notably perhaps is the bottom where they say, well, we are the comité of El Patronato in Miami, right? It's this